Good morning. So a question people always ask tuber is, do you prefer 2D or 3D? I like your 2D model, the 3D model was trash. Huh? I like your 3D model, the 2D model was trash. Well, both models serve different roles. So let's start with the first part. Is it better to be 3D or 2D? So what you are seeing right now is the same input sent to both the 3D and 2D model. The first thing you are going to notice is that the 3D model has a much wider range of movement. The 2D model, meanwhile, has a lot more detail. Now it is possible to get more detail into a 3D model. However, this 3D model is already 20 times larger than the 2D. And if you look at Task Manager, you'll see that just having both models up takes up around 9 GB of the GPU's video memory. So this is how much power running both models at maximum settings. Now if I dial down the settings a bit, I can play 2D games with the 3D model without a problem. The catch is the 3D model can consume around 30% of the GPU. On a 3090. So this is why most games I run at 2560 by 1440. Next, eye tracking. This is our kit. On both models. However, the Live2D is not rigged for a tool known as vBridger. Since it's not rigged for it, there's a few less mouse shapes it can do. And since I primarily use TTS, those shapes are usually not available to the lip sync itself. Like if I turn lip sync off, my lips usually don't move as exaggerated. Oh, I said, this is my lips moving. If you are not a TTS or Muse streamer, even having the lip sync one can help give that more anime style lip movement. Now, what does the 2D do better? Well, the 2D can have fixed animations. And what the 3D can do. The 3D can't actually have fixed animations, because the arcade is directly mapped to the face. For hand leap motion is mapped to the hands. You can have an animation that will break the input motion. Whereas on the 2, So this is just the wand attach. Hand motions in vtuber are always arms. As you can see, running both models at the same time isn't a supported configuration. And you will. So because running two models at the same time is not a supported configuration, it results in some interesting conflicts with the toggles. So with Live 2D, you don't have a lot of control of how the model exists in a scene. Pretty much the 2D will always be on the zero plane. And if I load a background directly into Tube 2D, what you're seeing now is VNAN as the background to VTS. VTS is still in front. But now I can see both models on the screen. If it seems like I'm staring into space, it's because the center of focus for both models is above the screen. So something you need to do for 2D models is set where the natural gaze rests. So if your phone is directly to the left or right of the screen, your eyes will always be looking to the left or right, unless you calibrate the camera to treat this as your center. Whereas on 3D models, the model is actually mapping what the phone says. So if your eyes are looking to the left or right, the model will look left or right. And this is because Orchid actually uses a 3D model with like 4,000 polygons to approximate your face. So it's very accurate. But only iPhones do this. Google's Arcor and MediaPipe do not have this level of accuracy, and they use AI models to determine things. NVIDIA's RTX likewise uses AI models to approximate things. It is possible to have much higher detailed 3D models. But in order to use them, you would need to dedicate a computer to it. Because the 3D model used for tubing has as much geometry as an entire VRChat world. Likewise, it's possible to build a Live 2D rig that blows the performance of the computer out of the water. This is not VTube Studio's fault. This is because games assume they have exclusive use of the GPU. And likewise, Windows and GPU drivers assume any game is exclusive to GPU. So when you use Live 2D and you want to add a bunch of fun novelty toys to it, each of these toys is another game to the operating system. So remember the GPU meter before. Well, now let me show you the GPU meter with program loaded and doing things. So what you see here is the GPU is around 35%, but is using 11.1 gigabytes of video memory. So those are redeems I have on the 2D that match the same redeems on the 3D. Now, since the stream isn't running, I can't demonstrate what happens when both are running. But just to have the throwing program open adds 2 gigabytes of overhead. Whereas on the 3D, this has to be part of the 3D application. So another thing that the 3D is potentially better. You can have objects that directly interact with the model. You can also break it. Off, dang it. Okay. So on the 3D, I have the same throwing redeems set out. Anyway, with the 3D you can have objects interact with the model. Likewise, a suitable 3D model in VAR chat can interact with other models. Live 2D cannot interact with 3D or other 2D models because it's always on the 0 plane. So you can change how 2D models are layered in OBS. Or if you are using vtuber Studio's native method for collaborating, you can do stuff within the collab to change the layers. However, there is still no way for a 2D and a 3D to interact, they will either always be on the same Z plane. And if you put a 2D model in a 3D world, it will be flat. So there's not much you can do about that except pay someone to create a 3D model exactly the same as the 2D model. The downside to that, and my model is guilty of that, because of how much detail a model has. For example, the ruffles and the bows on the tube. Would probably make the geometry on a 3D way too difficult. And because the wings are already big enough, that adds another clipping issue that cannot be solved with a VRM file. Basically, ruffles you see on video game models' clothing are usually cheats. They're not actually individually rigged ruffles, but rather they are baked into the underlying clothing and instead move like they are part of the underlying clothing. So where you would typically spin 3, the skirt doesn't flip. And because the skirt can't flip, the ruffles would likewise not move. And because the skirt can't flip, the ruffles would likewise not move. Notice how lightly clipped through skirt. This is again because the skirt actually has no cloth physics on it. Anyway, next topic. Your model is trash, I liked the last one. Now here's the thing. Most vtubers like getting new models. Every artist has something they pay attention to. Every rigger has their own unique style. So if you don't like a certain model, it's likely you don't like how that artist or that rigger does their models. For example, for me, the only model designs I've not liked are models that deviate too far from a anime. Like this 3D model is less detailed than the 2D. This is because I looked at the skirt and was like, that is going to take the rigger a month. So I told the rigger, you can simplify the costume. I'm fine with that. And both models cost around the same amount. If I wanted to spend 5 times as much money, I'm sure I could pay someone to model and rig something that is 1-to-1 to a 2D. But when I decided to get the 3D, I wanted it so I could do things that only a 3D model could do. The big catch there is that gear that you need for 3D is expensive and usually kind of crappy overall. When people talk about full body 3D, what they mean is buying a $5,000 mocap suit. And those suits are often not designed for hours of use, only maybe 2 or 3 hours. I stream for 12. Likewise, VR gear is cheaper than mocap. The Sony Mocopi and Slime VR gear is basically the same idea as wearing VR trackers. It works, but you need to have a model that is of the appropriate scale to use. and trying to do 3D with our kit and 3D with VR trackers is very complicated. If you've ever seen a mocap setup, you basically have iPhone mounted to your head for your face tracking, plus 6 to 12 VR trackers. And they only last about 3 hours. And more to the point, they are impaired by reflections in the room. So a mocap studio, or an apartment or house, has to have the space designed almost as a Faraday cage. Otherwise, the signals for the VR will get stomped on by Wi-Fi signals. And if you like wireless mouse, keyboard, and other controller wheels, those will stomp on your VR gear too. In an ideal situation for tubers, you would just need an array of cameras. A single iPhone won't work. You would need a series of stereo cameras like the Intel RealSense. And if you've never seen how this works, basically a stereo camera sees 2 infrared images and 1 color image. And the software computes depth from this. So if you had 8 of these, you could move in 3D space easily. But nobody has designed a setup like this. And when the cameras cost $500 a piece, may as well stick with the VR trackers. 2D has one advantage in this case. So with 2D, you only need 1 camera. So your initial investment is either a $200 webcam or a $1,000 iPhone. Whereas for 3D, you could be spending thousands of dollars. And you still might end up having a poor experience. Like my main suggestion here. Always have a 3D, a 2, and a Chiba. You want to have a 3D for when you are doing things you need to move in, like VR chat. Or if you naturally have a lot of movement. Like I'm always moving my hands when I speak. Even if I don't really say anything with the hands, I like to point at things. So doing informative stuff, for me, is probably best done with the 3D. However, just chatting. I do have facial reactions that are only visible in 3D. Notice how different that is. In that case, the 3D is actually closer to the look, whereas the 2D does the anime faces. It's very hard to get the 3D to do anime faces without having a toggle for it, because the 3D is mapping to the actual face shape. But the 2D just goes, oh, if the eyes are this closed, use this shape. And if I were to do 2D rigging myself, I might opt for a lot more shapes. So the barrier to entry is a lot lower for 3. If you don't want to spend a lot of money on a 3D, you can buy a pre-made model. So this model you might recognize. This is the model that Filian uses. It's like $90. Where isn't Toot? So this is the Jenny model. It's one of the few 2D models you can customize. But you notice she's kinda randomly moving. This is because the default settings are mapped to keys. The catch to using these models is notice how both are kinda frowning. This is because these are not customized. This is the 2D model that comes with vtuber Studio. It also has keys mapped to the keyboard. The thing you will notice with this 3D is that it looks kind of broken. This is because it is not designed for VTubing programs. It's designed for VR chat. All its toggles are in the VR chat version. If you want to use this in V9, you have to set up toggles for the 3D software to use, and this does not have any. Like with the 3D small model. Doesn't have toggles set up for this software either. Basically all I can do out of the box with the small model is move the arms and blink. And if the 3D model is reared with cloth physics, it actually becomes a bit broken. So this is a version of the model which added additional colliders to. Unfortunately, this trades clipping for breaking the model. If I run this model in the dance software, the legs will clip even harder through the skirt. And regardless, it takes about a minute to load the 3D model. Notice how the entire program lagged. So as it is, the 3D is more complex to set up. It's harder to rig if you want detail like the tube. And you will have random commenters who say they don't like the 3D. The 2D, on the other hand, people will say looks nicer, prettier, etc. But the 2D is much more expensive to make it expressive. And high-end riggers like Twillen and Diarico are usually very far out of people's price ranges. There are probably more Live 2D riggers than 3D riggers. However, 3D has a lower barrier to entry due to Vroid. Vroid means that you don't have to settle for a pre-made model if you don't find something you like. However, with 2D models, there is no equal to Vroid. You have to buy a 2D model you're allowed to customize. And most of them don't allow customization beyond changing a logo on a shirt or something. However, you don't have to start with a rigid live-2D. You can start with a PNG. Just hire someone to design you a flat model. See if you like it. See if people react to it or just kinda ignore it. Like half of VTubing itself is performance. The other half is conveying visual information. So if you're playing a game, the visual information is right there in the game. But are you reading the text or just clicking through it? For me, I used to try and read the text and everything. However, some games auto-advance. And other games like Final Fantasy XIV have so much text that it would take forever to do the way I do it. But I manually transcribe from games that I can't use tools on. So most Unity games I can use tools on. So I can keep pace with the game easier. But games like Final Fantasy XIV have no way of screen reading, so there's nothing I can do. Please, game developers, create an API in your games to output the text. Especially with VTubers. Because if they can pipe the text from the game through their software, they can read the text in various ways or languages. Otherwise, it requires them to be able to read at the pace the game presents the text at, and people who do not speak English natively are at a disadvantage. And then TTS streamers like myself and Zentria could read the text at the pace the game displays it, instead of having to wait a few seconds every time. Even having just an option to send text to clipboard is an improvement. One of the neat things about 3D is you can tell if I'm doing hydrate redeems or not. Whereas the 2D, not a chance. So overall, the 3D is better for circumstances that require smooth visual information conveyed by the performer. Whereas the D is better for when your performance is mostly through your voice. If you are a TTS streamer, the 2D might actually be better in that case. Because the 2D can be delayed by a few frames to align the audio. Whereas the 3D can't be delayed. At any rate, in terms of costs, barrier to entry is lower for 3D models. All you need is Void and a webcam. Barrier to entry for 2D requires buying or commissioning a model. And to get the most out of a two-door, a 3D model, you need an iPhone. Or you need to dedicate an entire gaming computer. This is one of the problems that people don't mention. Only the iPhone gives you our kit. All other myths use a GPU input at around 240p. And can't do 60 frames per second. When you play 2D games, you can generally use a 3D model if you have a high-end GPU, or you are playing a 3D game that typically uses half the GPU or requires 8 GB of memory. Then a 3D model will suffer. And your game performance will likewise suffer. So if you are playing a game like Helldivers 2 or Pacific Drive or Grand Theft Auto or Nier Automata, use the 2D model. Those games will fight the 3D model, even if you have a 24 GB GPU. If you are, however, playing Final Fantasy XIV currently, even at 4,000, Final Fantasy XIV aims to cap out at 8 GB. However, if you play something that is bleeding edge, say Cyberpunk, or if you play a game that is heavily modded, like Skyrim, those can even choke out a 2D model. So if you wanted to play games like that, you should consider a 2D chibi. Just make sure your rigger knows you need a low complexity model rather than a 2D chibi that is rigged as much as a regular one, or a regular 2D that becomes chibi. Likewise, a 3D chibi might work as long as it's rigged to VR chat HMD spec. Basically, if your model won't work on a standalone hand, yeah, then it likely is too heavy. So if you play a high-end 3D game, but neither of those are options, reactive PNG. Any. This concludes my 2D versus 3D video. Have a good day.